In the black waters of the North Atlantic, the men who had ruled the seas began to whisper of a single enemy formation that meant almost certain death. For years, Admiral Donit's U-boat wolf packs had strangled Britain's lifeline, sinking merchant ships faster than they could be built and spreading terror across every convoy route. The submariners were confident, aggressive, and convinced the war beneath the waves was theirs. Then came a Royal Navy officer whose obsession with anti-submarine warfare would rewrite the rules. A hunter-killer group that pursued its prey for hours, sometimes days, until the sea gave up the wreckage. By May 1943, the hunters had become the hunted, and German crews learned to dread one name above all others. This is the story of how a single Allied commander and his destroyers broke the morale of the U-boat fleet and became the greatest fear the German submarine service ever knew. In the autumn of 1940, the North Atlantic became a killing ground. German submarines slipped through the gray waters between Britain and North America, striking convoys with a precision and ferocity that left the Royal Navy reeling. In a single stretch of days that October, a pack of U-boats fell upon 2 eastbound convoys and sent more than 30 merchant ships to the bottom. The waters filled with burning oil, shattered cargo, and the desperate cries of drowning sailors. To the German crews who fired the torpedoes, this was not tragedy. This was the beginning of what they would come to call the happy time. The success was staggering, and it was no accident. Behind it stood a single architect, a man whose name would haunt Allied strategists for the next 3 years. Admiral Karl Donitz had commanded submarines in the First World War, and he had emerged from that earlier conflict with a hard conviction. Germany had lost the submarine war of 1917, not because the weapon was flawed, but because it had been used wrongly. Individual boats had hunted alone, scattered across vast oceans, easily isolated and destroyed. Donitz believed the answer was to concentrate force, to make the hunters swarm together, and to strike when the enemy was most vulnerable. The tactic he devised became known as the wolf pack. Rather than sending submarines out singly to patrol fixed zones, Donitz coordinated them in groups spread across a wide line, like a net drawn taut across the shipping lanes. When one boat sighted a convoy, it did not attack immediately. Instead, it shadowed the ships from a distance, radioing their position, course, and speed back to headquarters. Donitz, directing the battle from his command post ashore, then vectored every available submarine toward the target. Only when the pack had assembled did the killing begin, and it usually began at night. This was the genius and the terror of the method. A convoy might be escorted by a handful of warships, enough perhaps to fend off a lone attacker. But against 6 or 8 or 10 submarines striking from multiple directions in darkness, the defenders were hopelessly outnumbered. While escorts chased one contact, others slipped through the gaps to loose their torpedoes into the merchant columns. The U-boats attacked on the surface at night, running fast on their diesel engines, presenting a silhouette so low that lookouts could barely see them against the black water. Underwater detection gear, the ASDIC that the Royal Navy trusted so heavily, was useless against a submarine riding atop the waves. The technology of 1940 simply had no answer. The stakes of this contest could hardly have been higher, because Britain's very survival hung upon the sea. The island nation could not feed itself. It could not fuel its aircraft, arm its factories, or supply its armies without a constant river of cargo flowing across the ocean. Every month, millions of tons of food, oil, steel, and munitions had to reach British ports, and nearly all of it came by ship. Winston Churchill understood this with brutal clarity. He would later confess that the only thing during the entire war that truly frightened him was the U-boat peril. If the lifeline across the Atlantic were severed, Britain would be starved into submission without a single enemy soldier setting foot on its soil. To protect that lifeline, the Allies organized their merchant vessels into convoys, great herds of ships sailing together under the protection of naval escorts. The logic was sound. A convoy was easier to defend than scattered ships, and the vast emptiness of the ocean meant that a concentrated group was statistically harder to find than many individual targets spread across thousands of square miles. But the system had a fatal weakness in these early years. There were never enough escorts. The Royal Navy, stretched thin across the globe, could assign only a few warships to guard convoys that sometimes numbered 40 or 50 merchantmen. Worse still, the escorts could not accompany the ships the whole way. Beyond a certain point in the mid-Atlantic, the warships turned back for lack of range, leaving the convoys to cross a deadly gap of open water entirely unprotected. It was in this gap, this black hole in the middle of and skilled. Their tactics were tearing the enemy's supply system apart. Dönitz calculated coldly that if his submarines could sink merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them, Britain would eventually collapse. He set his target in tonnage, a war of arithmetic, and for a time the arithmetic ran entirely in Germany's favor. The young officers who took command of these boats believed they were participating in a decisive campaign, one that might win the war outright before American industry could tip the balance. This confidence hardened into something like certainty. German propaganda proclaimed the submarine crews as the gray wolves of the Atlantic, and the men embraced the image. They went to sea believing that the ocean belonged to them, that the hunters would always hold the advantage over the hunted. The escort warships they encountered seemed too few and too slow, armed with detection equipment that failed against surface attacks and depth charges that rarely found their mark. Every returning boat brought fresh tales of easy victories, of convoys ripped apart, of merchant ships burning to the horizon. It was a period of intoxicating success, and it convinced the German submarine command that the Battle of the Atlantic was theirs to win. But confidence built on a temporary technological advantage is a fragile thing. The Allies were not standing still. In laboratories and shipyards, in intelligence bureaus and training schools, the machinery of a response was already beginning to turn. New weapons, new tactics, new ships, and new ways of hunting the hunters were taking shape. Among them would come a class of warship, and one vessel in particular, that the U-boat crews would learn to dread above all others. The happy time would not last forever, and when it ended, it would end in the very waters where the gray wolves had once believed themselves invincible. By the end of 1941, the ledger of the Atlantic War read like a slow catastrophe. German submarines had sent more than 2 million tons of Allied shipping to the bottom in a single year, and the figure was climbing. Each ton represented food, fuel, ammunition, and raw material that Britain could not produce for itself. The island nation consumed imports at a rate that demanded a constant procession of merchant ships crossing the ocean, and every vessel lost widened a gap that British shipyards struggled to close. Dönitz had framed the campaign as a mathematical contest, and through 1941 the mathematics favored Germany with alarming consistency. The tonnage sunk outpaced the tonnage built, and every month that the trend continued brought the prospect of British collapse closer. Then came 1942, and the situation grew worse still. The entry of the United States into the war in December 1941 should have strengthened the Allied position, but in the short term it opened a vast new hunting ground. Dönitz launched Operation Drumbeat, sending his boats to the eastern seaboard of the United States, where coastal cities still burned their lights at night and merchant ships sailed unescorted and unaware. The silhouettes of tankers stood out against the glow of the American coastline, and U-boat commanders picked them off with a leisurely precision that felt almost like target practice. In the first 6 months of 1942 alone, German submarines sank hundreds of ships in American and Caribbean waters. The slaughter along that coast became known among the German crews as the Second Happy Time, a period of easy victories that echoed the triumphs of 1940. The vessels feeding this destruction were rarely built to survive it. The typical merchant ship of the convoys was a slow, deep-hulled carrier designed for economy rather than defense. Many could manage no more than 8 or 10 knots, a crawling pace that gave submarines every advantage in positioning and pursuit. Their armament, where it existed at all, amounted to a single deck gun and perhaps a light anti-aircraft weapon manned by naval gunners attached to civilian crews. Against a submerged attacker, these defenses were meaningless. A torpedo struck without warning, and a ship laden with fuel or ammunition could be gone in minutes, leaving little more than an oil slick and a scattering of debris. The men who sailed these ships knew they were riding cargo holds that offered no protection and vessels too sluggish to run. The ocean itself was an enemy that spared no one. The North Atlantic in winter was among the most hostile stretches of water anywhere on Earth, a region of towering gray swells, freezing spray, and gales that could scatter an entire convoy across hundreds of miles. Ice formed on decks and rigging, adding dangerous weight to ships already straining against the sea. Visibility collapsed in fog and driving rain, and the cold pressed relentlessly against every man aboard. For the merchant sailors and their escorts, this weather compounded the danger of the U-boats, because a ship separated from the protection of the convoy became a solitary target, and a man swept overboard or forced into the water had only minutes before the cold killed him. Yet the same conditions punished the Germans as well. The crews of the Type 7 boats endured cramped, sodden, freezing hulls, sickening motion on the surface, and long patrols in miserable discomfort. The Atlantic was indifferent to which flag a sailor served, and it took lives from both sides without distinction. Against this backdrop, the Allied methods of defense proved painfully inadequate. The escort forces of 1941 and early 1942 were stretched thin, often too few in number to cover the sprawling formations of ships they were assigned to protect. Their principal detection tool underwater was the sonar device the British called ASDIC, which could locate a submerged submarine by bouncing sound waves through the water. It was a genuine advance, but it carried a crippling limitation. It could not detect a submarine on the surface, and the wolf packs had learned to attack on the surface at night, running fast between the columns of merchant ships where the escorts least expected them. A submarine riding low in the darkness presented a tiny target and could slip in, fire, and slip away before an escort ever registered its presence. The Allied advantage in undersea detection was therefore neutralized by the simple German tactic of staying above the water where the sonar could not reach. Even when an escort did locate a submarine, the weapons available to attack it were blunt instruments. The depth charge, a canister of explosive set to detonate at a chosen depth, was the standard tool, rolled off the stern or fired to the sides in patterns. But a depth charge had to explode close to a submarine's hull to inflict fatal damage, and the escort dropping it lost sonar contact in the final moments of the attack, forced to estimate where the target had gone. A skilled U-boat commander could turn, dive deeper, or change speed in the blind interval and escape the killing zone. Depth charge attacks consumed hours and expended enormous quantities of ordnance while sinking comparatively few boats. The exchange rate ran heavily in Germany's favor, and every failed hunt left the convoy exposed while its escorts chased the phantom. The coordinated nature of the Wolfpack assaults made the problem worse. A single submarine sighting a convoy would shadow it from a distance, radioing its position, course, and speed back to Donitz's headquarters. From there, orders went out to other boats across a wide area, drawing them toward the convoy over the following hours until a concentration of submarines had gathered. Then they struck together, often overwhelming the handful of escorts with simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. While the escorts pursued one contact, others fired freely into the mass of merchant ships. The convoy commanders found themselves defending against codebreakers labored to penetrate the German naval ciphers and read the orders flowing between Dönitz and his boats. New escort vessels were laid down in growing numbers, faster and better equipped than the ships that had gone before. Tactics were rewritten to hunt submarines aggressively rather than merely to shield the convoys. And from this convergence of effort would emerge the ships and the men that finally broke the wolf packs, and one warship above all whose name the U-boat crews would come to speak with fear. Frederic John Walker was not the officer the Royal Navy expected to save the Atlantic. Born in Plymouth in 1896 into a naval family, he had entered the service as a boy and passed through the same training and the same postings as thousands of other officers of his generation. What set him apart emerged slowly and against considerable resistance, for by the time the war reached its crisis, he had spent the better part of 2 decades studying a single problem that most of his superiors regarded as marginal. That problem was the submarine, and Walker had come to understand it more deeply than almost anyone else in the fleet. His fascination with anti-submarine warfare took root in the years after the First World War, when the memory of the German U-boat campaign of 1917 and 1918 was still fresh. That earlier campaign had come dangerously close to starving Britain into surrender, and it had been checked only late and at enormous cost. Walker belonged to a small group of officers who refused to treat the episode as a closed chapter of history. He believed the submarine would return as a decisive weapon, and he set himself to learn how it could be hunted and destroyed. Through the 1920s and 1930s, he immersed himself in the emerging science of underwater detection, in the tactics of escort work, and in the training methods that might turn ordinary crews into effective submarine killers. In 1937, he was appointed to the position that suited him best, becoming an anti-submarine instructor, and later the officer responsible for developing tactics at the Navy's principal training establishment for the work. There he was able to shape doctrine directly, drilling crews in the use of ASDIC, the sound-ranging equipment that promised to locate a submerged submarine, and in the coordinated attacks that were supposed to follow. He pressed his students hard, and he pressed the equipment harder, probing its weaknesses and searching constantly for ways to close the gap between a contact detected and a submarine sunk. It was patient, technical, unglamorous work, and it earned him respect among specialists even as it kept him at the edges of the mainstream naval career. That marginal position carried a price. In the promotion-conscious world of the interwar Navy, the fast track to advancement ran through the great gunnery ships and the fleet actions that senior officers still imagined would decide the next war. Anti-submarine work was viewed as a backwater, a technical specialty for men who lacked the polish for command of a battleship or a cruiser. Walker's dedication to it, however genuine, did not impress the boards that decided which officers would rise. By the late 1930s, his career had stalled. He had been passed over for promotion to captain, and by the ordinary logic of the service, his prospects were effectively finished. The lesser man might have accepted the verdict and drifted quietly toward retirement. Walker did not. He continued to develop his ideas about how escorts should fight, and those ideas increasingly diverged from official orthodoxy. The prevailing doctrine held that the escort's first duty was defensive, to remain close to the convoy, and to drive off attackers rather than to leave the merchant ships unguarded in pursuit of a kill. Walker came to believe this thinking was fundamentally flawed. An escort that merely shielded the convoy surrendered the initiative to the enemy, forced to react to each attack as it came, and unable ever to remove the threat. He argued instead for aggression, for hunting the submarine down and killing it, for treating the U-boat not as a nuisance to be warded off, but as a target to be destroyed. A dead U-boat, he reasoned, could never attack a convoy again, and every one sunk was a permanent subtraction from the enemy's strength. This was a significant departure from accepted practice, and it did not endear him to those who preferred caution. Walker's conviction that the escort should carry the fight to the enemy required close coordination between ships, precise timing, and a willingness to press an attack home even when the contact grew faint. He worked out methods to keep a submarine pinned and to attack it repeatedly until it was destroyed, using two ships in concert so that one could hold the contact while the other delivered the blow. These techniques demanded discipline and practice far beyond what most escort crews had received, and they ran against the instinct to stay near the convoy at all costs. Walker was certain he was right, and his certainty had the quality of obsession, for the U-boat had become for him something more than a professional interest. He approached the submarine as a personal adversary, a problem he was determined to master completely, and he brought to the task a relentless intensity that could unsettle those around him. He studied the habits of U-boat commanders, the way they approached the convoy, the depths at which they preferred to run, the moments at which they were most vulnerable. He thought about the enemy constantly, turning the tactical puzzle over in his mind until he had anticipated the moves his opponent might make. This single-mindedness, which the promotion boards had regarded as narrowness, was in truth the mark of genuine expertise. He knew the U-boat as a hunter knows his quarry. When war came in September 1939, Walker was still ashore, still passed over, still occupying a specialist post that carried little prestige. The early months of the conflict brought no immediate change to his fortunes, and he found himself watching from a distance as the U-boat threat he had long predicted began to materialize in the Atlantic. He requested a sea command repeatedly and was repeatedly disappointed. The very qualities that made him supremely qualified for the coming struggle were the ones the peacetime system had penalized, and it took the mounting disaster at sea, the accumulating tonnage of sunken ships described in the reports reaching London, to force a reconsideration of the men who might reverse it. Slowly the Navy came to understand that it needed exactly the kind of officer it had spent years overlooking. The reputation Walker had quietly built among fellow specialists now began to work in his favor. Those who had trained under him or served alongside him knew the depth of his knowledge and the force of his conviction, and as the demand for capable anti-submarine leaders grew, his name rose with it. He was not a self-promoter, and he did not court the favor of superiors, but the value of what he had spent 2 decades learning became impossible to ignore once the U-boats were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. The peril that Churchill would later confess had frightened him more than anything else in the war was precisely the peril Walker had prepared his whole career to meet. His methods, once dismissed as eccentric, were about to be tested against the enemy he had studied for so long. Walker believed that an escort group trained to hunt as a coordinated team, drilled relentlessly until its tactics became instinctive, could do what scattered and reactive escorts had never managed. He believed a submarine could be found, held, and destroyed with reliable regularity if only the crews were bold enough and skilled boat was forced to the surface or crushed beneath the sea. The hunters would finally be free to hunt. Walker's command consisted of a group of sloops and escort vessels, small warships purpose-built for the anti-submarine role, rather than the fleet actions that had shaped naval thinking for generations. His own ship was the sloop Starling, and around her he gathered a cluster of consorts whose names would become familiar in the Admiralty's tracking rooms over the coming months. These were not glamorous vessels. They lacked the speed of a fleet destroyer and the firepower of a cruiser, but they had been designed with a specific enemy in mind, and in Walker's hands they became something far more dangerous than their modest dimensions suggested. What set the support group apart was the technology packed into those unassuming hulls. By 1943, the tools of submarine detection had advanced dramatically from the crude and easily deceived equipment of the war's opening years. The ships carried improved ASDIC sets, the underwater sound-ranging apparatus that could locate a submerged submarine by bouncing acoustic pulses off its hull, and the newer versions offered better accuracy and the ability to hold a contact more reliably as the range closed. Radar had matured as well, stripping away the darkness that had once allowed U-boats to attack on the surface at night with near impunity. The high-frequency direction-finding sets, capable of pinpointing the position of a U-boat the moment it transmitted a radio signal, gave Walker the means to locate the enemy before the enemy even knew he had been detected. The weaponry had evolved to match. The traditional depth charge, rolled off the stern and set to explode at a chosen depth, suffered from a fatal flaw that had frustrated escorts throughout the war. As an attacking ship passed over its target, its ASDIC lost contact in the final moments, forcing the crew to guess where the submarine had gone during the blind seconds before the charges detonated. A skilled U-boat commander could exploit that gap, turning sharply the instant he heard the attacking ship overhead. The answer arriving in Walker's arsenal was the ahead-throwing weapon, a device that fired a pattern of small bombs forward of the ship while ASDIC contact was still held. The submarine could be struck without the attacker ever losing track of it. Combined with heavier depth charges set for greater depths, these weapons transformed the mathematics of the kill. Yet Walker understood that technology alone would decide nothing. The instruments were only as good as the men who read them and the tactics that directed their use, and here his long years of study and rehearsal became decisive. He drilled his crews with a relentlessness that bordered on obsession, running exercise after exercise until every man aboard every ship knew his part without hesitation. He taught his hydrophone and ASDIC operators to interpret the faint returns and echoes as a hunter reads tracks in the snow, distinguishing a genuine submarine from a shoal of fish or a thermal layer in the water. He trained his captains to think as a single coordinated body rather than as isolated ships reacting independently to whatever crossed their path. The centerpiece of his method was a technique he refined into a deadly routine in which one ship held the submerged U-boat firmly on its ASDIC while a second ship, directed by the first, moved in to deliver the attack. Because the attacking vessel no longer had to track the target itself, it did not matter that its own contact faded in the final approach. The directing ship maintained an unbroken picture, guiding the attacker onto the submarine and calling the moment to fire. Walker gave this creeping, patient method a discipline that turned the destruction of a U-boat from a matter of luck into a matter of procedure. Where earlier escorts had made a single furious pass and moved on, his group would fasten onto a contact and refuse to let go, working it methodically for hour after hour until the submarine's air and battery power drained away and it had no choice but to rise into the guns waiting above. This was aggression organized into system. Walker rejected the notion that a U-boat which had escaped the immediate vicinity of a convoy was a lost cause. He believed, and now had the means to prove, that a submerged submarine was a slow, half-blind, and finite thing capable of remaining underwater only so long before its trapped crew and exhausted batteries forced it upward. A hunter with the patience to wait and the equipment to keep contact would eventually win. He drilled that conviction into his men until it replaced the anxious defensiveness that had characterized so much of the earlier war, and he built among his crews a hunger for the kill that mirrored his own. The creation of these hunter-killer groups signaled a profound shift in Allied strategy across the Atlantic. For 3 years, the campaign had been fought almost entirely on German terms, with the initiative lying with Dönitz and his wolf packs, while the Allies scrambled to react. The support group inverted that relationship. It marked the moment when the Allies stopped merely defending their shipping and began actively seeking the destruction of the U-boat arm itself. The strategy depended on more than Walker alone, drawing on the growing flood of Allied production, on the intelligence breakthroughs that were reading German naval signals, and on the arrival of long-range aircraft that closed the mid-Atlantic gap where U-boats had once operated beyond the reach of air cover. Walker's group was one part of a converging system, but it was the part that put the new offensive philosophy into its sharpest and most personal form. The timing could not have been more critical. The first months of 1943 had brought some of the heaviest convoy battles of the entire war, with the two sides locked in a struggle that both understood would determine the outcome of the Atlantic campaign. Dönitz had concentrated his forces for a decisive effort, throwing large numbers of submarines against the convoy routes in the belief that he could still sever Britain's lifeline. It was into this decisive phase that Walker's second support group sailed, carrying the accumulated learning of a career spent preparing for exactly this contest. The theory he had defended when no one wanted to hear it was about to be tested against the enemy in open water. Everything he had argued for now stood assembled in the ships under his flag. He had the vessels, the sensors, the weapons, and above all the crews trained to his exacting standard and imbued with his relentless offensive spirit. The doctrine that had stalled his career and marked him as an eccentric had become the sharpest weapon in the Allied arsenal, and the man who had spent 20 years being overlooked now sailed to meet the very threat he had spent those years studying. The U-boat crews of the North Atlantic were about to encounter a kind of pursuit they had never faced before, delivered by a commander who regarded them not as an unstoppable menace, but as prey to be run down and destroyed. The proving of his life's work was at hand. Walker's method rested on a single ruthless principle. Once his ships gained contact with a U-boat, they did not break it off until the submarine lay shattered on the ocean floor. This was the heart of everything he had preached during his long years in the wilderness, and now, in the spring of 1943, it became the operating logic of the second support group. Where earlier escorts had dropped a hasty pattern of depth charges and hurried back to shepherd their convoy, Walker's warships stayed. They circled, they listened, and they waited. quarry rather than threat. The hunter's mentality he instilled turned fear into eagerness, and it gave his group a cohesion and morale that translated directly into results. The contrast with the older way of war could hardly have been sharper. For 3 years, the Allied doctrine had been fundamentally defensive, built around the survival of the convoy rather than the destruction of the enemy. An escort commander's success had been measured by how many merchant ships reached port, and a U-boat driven off was counted as good as a U-boat sunk. This philosophy was understandable, born of scarce escorts and desperate need, but it handed the initiative permanently to the Germans. A submarine that submerged and slipped away lived to attack another convoy, and the same handful of experienced U-boat commanders returned again and again to inflict fresh losses. Walker rejected the entire premise. A driven-off U-boat, in his view, was a failure because it would resurface tomorrow and kill more sailors. Only a destroyed U-boat was truly neutralized, and only the systematic destruction of the U-boat arm could win the campaign. This demanded a patience that would have seemed reckless under the old rules. Walker's ships would hold contact on a single submerged submarine for hours on end, sometimes through an entire day and into the night, refusing to be shaken off. He knew the mathematics of the situation better than any man alive. A submerged U-boat ran on battery power that drained steadily, and it carried a finite supply of compressed air for its crew. It could creep along at a few knots for a limited time or dash briefly at higher speed and exhaust its batteries all the faster. Whatever it did, the clock ran against it. Sooner or later it would have to surface to recharge and to breathe, and when it did, Walker's ships and any aircraft overhead would be waiting. He had only to keep contact and outlast the enemy, and his sensors, his relief crews, and his own inexhaustible determination made that a contest the submarine could not win. For the men trapped inside those hulls, the experience was a slow psychological torture that the German submarine service had never anticipated. In the early war, a U-boat that dived deep and turned away could reasonably expect to escape within an hour or two, its pursuers frustrated and forced to return to their convoy. Under Walker, there was no such reprieve. The crew would hear the relentless ping of ASDIC probing the water around them, would feel the hull shudder under depth charge attacks, and would then endure the far worse silence of the creeping approach, in which they could not tell where the hunters were or when the next salvo would fall. Hours passed. The air grew foul and thick with carbon dioxide. The temperature rose, condensation streamed down the steel walls, and men lay still in the darkness to conserve oxygen, forbidden to move or speak. The batteries fell steadily toward exhaustion, and always above them, the ships remained patient and implacable, refusing to leave. This was warfare of the nerves as much as of the depth charge, and it broke men who had faced everything the earlier campaign could throw at them. U-boat crews had always known danger, but they had also known the reasonable hope of survival, the confidence that skill and cunning could carry them home. Walker stripped that hope away. Against his group, evasion no longer worked, and the veteran tricks that had served commanders for years failed against a hunter who simply would not be shaken. Reports and survivors' accounts spoke of the particular dread that spread through the submarine service as word passed of a British group that hunted its prey to death. The mere knowledge that such a formation existed and might be the source of any distant contact weighed on crews before a single charge had fallen. The strategic consequences of this reversal were enormous. Every U-boat that Walker's group destroyed was not merely a machine removed from the battle, but a trained crew lost forever, and the experienced commanders and engineers of the submarine arm could not be replaced as quickly as they were killed. Donitz could build submarines faster than the Allies could sink them for a time, but he could not manufacture veterans, and the steady attrition of his best men eroded the effectiveness of the entire force. Walker's hunter-killer philosophy attacked the U-boat arm at its most vulnerable point, its irreplaceable human core, and did so with a relentlessness that no defensive escort could ever have achieved. The initiative that had belonged to Germany since 1940 was passing, ship by ship and crew by crew, into Allied hands. What Walker had built was not simply a set of clever tactics, but a wholesale transformation of how the anti-submarine war was fought. He had turned the hunted into the hunter and the defensive into the offensive, and he had done it by combining technology, training, and an unbreakable aggressive spirit into a single coordinated instrument. The U-boat, once the terror of the Atlantic, was becoming the thing that fled, and the men inside it were learning the same dread that merchant sailors had lived with for 3 long years. In the battles that lay immediately ahead, Walker would put this new kind of hunting to the ultimate test, and the results would confirm, beyond any argument, that the balance of the Atlantic had finally begun to turn. The second support group put to sea in the early summer of 1943, and it did not take long for Walker's methods to prove themselves in cold water and open combat. The group sailed with a clear mandate not to shepherd merchant ships across the ocean and hope for the best, but to seek out submarines wherever intelligence and instinct pointed and to destroy them. Within days of these first patrols, the theory that Walker had spent years refining began to translate into wreckage on the seabed. The creeping attack, drilled endlessly in exercises off the Clyde, was about to be tested against real steel and real men, and the results would silence any lingering doubt within the Admiralty that his aggressive doctrine could work. The first kills came quickly and with a precision that startled even his own crews. Where earlier escort actions had often ended with a submarine merely damaged and driven under, only to slip away in the darkness, Walker's ships closed in and stayed. When contact was made, one vessel held the U-boat firmly on ASDIC while another moved in silently to deliver the killing barrage, exactly as the training had prescribed. Depth charges walked across the submerged target in tight overlapping patterns, and instead of the frustrating pause that had so often followed an attack in previous years, there came the telltale signs of destruction. Oil rose to the surface in spreading black slicks. Debris floated up through the swell, fragments of cork and wood, and the shattered contents of a hull that had been crushed far below. In several of these early engagements, the group logged confirmed sinkings within its opening weeks at sea, a rate of success that would have been almost unimaginable in the desperate months of 1942. Each of these victories followed a recognizable rhythm, and it was that rhythm, more than any single sinking, that began to unsettle the German submarine service. A U-boat commander caught by Walker's group did not experience a brief, chaotic depth charge attack followed by escape. He experienced something methodical and unhurried, a hunt that seemed to have no natural end. The pinging of the sonar would come and go, then come again from a different bearing. The engines above would fade into silence, Initiative that had defined the German campaign, the freedom to choose when and where to strike, was being taken from them by an enemy who chose instead to strike at the submarines themselves. This was precisely the reversal that Walker had spent his career arguing for, the transformation of the defensive escort into the offensive hunter, and now it was unfolding in the record of every patrol his group completed. The effect on the Germans was mirrored by an equal and opposite effect on the Allied side. For 3 long years, the story of the Atlantic had been one of grim endurance, of merchant sailors sailing into waters they knew might swallow them, of escort commanders doing their best with inadequate ships and outdated tactics. The losses had mounted without an obvious answer, and morale among the men who crewed the convoys and their escorts had been sustained more by stubbornness than by hope. The early successes of the second support group changed the emotional temperature of the campaign. Here, at last, was proof that the U-boat was not invincible, that its crews could be found, cornered, and destroyed with something approaching reliability. News of Walker's mounting tally circulated through the Royal Navy and beyond, offering a tangible reason for confidence where there had been mostly resolve. That confidence had a practical dimension as well as a moral one. Every submarine sent to the bottom in these opening patrols represented not only a machine destroyed, but a crew that would never sail again. And among those crews were the experienced officers and engineers on whom the German effort depended. The Allied High Command understood, as Walker did, that the true weakness of the U-boat arm lay in its irreplaceable men. Submarines could be built in numbers, but the veteran commanders who knew how to press home an attack in a heavy sea, and the skilled engineers who kept temperamental machinery running under the strain of combat, could not be produced on a timetable. By striking at these men directly, the group's early kills inflicted damage far out of proportion to the raw number of hulls sunk, and every success narrowed the pool of experience from which Dönitz could draw. There was, in these first encounters, a sense that a long-anticipated collision had finally arrived and had gone the way the Allies needed it to go. The doctrine that Walker had championed for years, often against the skepticism of superiors who preferred the traditional forms of naval warfare, was being vindicated in the only arena that mattered. The training, the technology, and the aggressive philosophy that had been assembled with such care were functioning together exactly as intended, and the seabed of the Eastern Atlantic was beginning to fill with the evidence. What had been theory and argument in the exercise areas of Scotland was now confirmed fact, written in oil slicks and floating debris and the silence of submarines that never radioed home. Yet these opening successes were only the beginning of what the group would accomplish, and Walker himself understood that the true measure of his methods would come in the larger and more concentrated battles still ahead. The German command had not yet fully grasped the scale of the danger, and its submarines continued to sail, still hoping that skill and numbers might restore the old advantage. But the pattern had been set. The hunter had found its stride, the prey had begun to feel the change, and the war beneath the Atlantic was tilting, encounter by encounter, toward a conclusion that Walker had foreseen long before anyone else believed it possible. That larger test arrived at the end of January 1944, when Walker took his group south into the waters off the Iberian coast, where German submarines still gathered in strength to intercept the convoys running toward Gibraltar. The second support group was no longer a novelty but a proven instrument, and the men who crewed its 6 sloops had absorbed their commander's methods until they operated almost as a single organism. The vessels moved in coordinated sweeps, holding contact for hours, refusing to let a submerged enemy slip away under the cover of darkness or bad weather. Where earlier escorts had been satisfied to drive a U-boat down and protect their charges, Walker demanded destruction, and he had the patience to wait until it came. The results were extraordinary. Over the course of a single patrol, the group destroyed 6 submarines, a figure so far beyond ordinary experience that the Admiralty at first struggled to credit it. Each kill followed the same relentless script. A contact was gained, the sloops closed and encircled, and the depth charges fell in carefully timed patterns designed to pin the enemy at depth and exhaust his air and his nerve. German commanders who had been trained to endure the brief fury of a passing attack now faced something they had never rehearsed against: an enemy who would stay overhead for 6, 8, or 10 hours, sending down wave after wave until the hull failed or the crew broke. The sea gave up its confirmation in the familiar language of wreckage and oil. When the group returned to Liverpool in late February, crowds gathered along the quayside, and the First Lord of the Admiralty came in person to mark the achievement. It was a moment of public celebration, but its deeper meaning lay in the numbers now accumulating across the theater. The exchange rate of the Atlantic War had reversed. Where once a handful of escorts had struggled to hold off the wolf packs, a single well-drilled group could now hunt them to extinction, and the German submarine arm was losing boats faster than its yards could build them or its schools could train their replacements. The veteran commanders, the men who carried the experience of the early triumphant years, were dying at a rate that no navy could sustain. For the crews of the U-boats, the change was felt as something close to dread. Intercepted signals and post-war interrogations revealed how the mood had shifted, how the confidence of 1940 and 1941 had curdled into a grim awareness that a patrol into the eastern Atlantic was increasingly a journey from which no return could be assumed. The presence of a determined support group in the vicinity was enough to keep boats submerged and impotent, unable to charge their batteries or press an attack, waiting out the hours in the hope that the hunters would move on. Often they did not. The psychological weapon Walker had forged proved as decisive as the depth charge, for a submarine that dared not surface and dared not attack had already been defeated without a single hit. The strategic significance widened with every passing month. The convoys that had once bled tonnage across the entire ocean now arrived intact, their cargoes of fuel, food, and munitions feeding the buildup for the invasion of Europe that everyone knew was coming. The security of those sea lanes was the precondition for everything the Allies intended to do on the continent, and it was being purchased in the cold water where Walker's sloops hunted. What had begun as one officer's stubborn conviction had become a template studied and copied throughout the escort forces, and the tide that had seemed so precarious only a year before was now running hard and irreversibly in the Allies' favor. In May of 1943, the arithmetic of the Atlantic collapsed for Germany. In a single month, the U-boat arm lost 41 submarines, a figure that would have seemed unimaginable only a year earlier, when the wolf packs still roamed the convoy lanes almost at will. The men who survived that month gave it a name that carried its own verdict, and they called it Black May. It was not a single battle, but a compounding disaster, a series of convoy engagements in which the hunters became the hunted, and the sea that had once swallowed Allied control rooms felt the walls closing in from every direction at once. Nowhere was this clearer than in the great convoy battles of that month, where packs of a dozen or more U-boats were thrown against columns of merchant ships and came away shattered. Convoys that the German command had expected to savage crossed with minimal loss, while the attacking boats were driven under, pinned, and destroyed in numbers that no operational report could soften. The exchange had inverted so completely that a single crossing might cost the U-boat arm several irreplaceable boats and their experienced crews while sinking few or none of the ships they had been sent to attack. For Admiral Dönitz, who had built the Wolfpack strategy and staked the outcome of the war upon it, the figures arriving at his headquarters were unbearable. He had always understood the campaign as a race of tonnage, a contest between what his boats could sink and what Allied yards could build, and by the spring of 1943 both sides of that ledger had turned against him. The Allies were now building merchant ships faster than his crews could destroy them, and they were sinking his submarines faster than his own yards could replace them. The mathematics that had once promised victory now promised only attrition, and attrition was a game Germany could not win. Late in May, Dönitz made the decision that acknowledged the defeat without ever quite naming it. He ordered the withdrawal of his boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes, pulling them back from the very waters where the campaign had been meant to be decided. It was framed as a temporary regrouping, a pause to await new weapons and new tactics, but everyone who understood the situation recognized it for what it was. The main battlefield of the Atlantic War had been conceded. The convoy lanes that Britain depended upon for survival were, for the first time in the war, effectively secure. The withdrawal did not end the fighting, but it marked the moment when the initiative passed permanently to the Allies. The support groups that had broken the packs did not stand down. They pressed outward into the transit routes and the distant patrol areas, seeking the boats wherever they now hid. Walker's group and others like it continued to hunt through the summer and beyond, ensuring that the respite Dönitz sought would never come. The U-boats that returned to the offensive later in the war did so as a diminished force, fighting a defensive struggle for their own survival rather than an offensive campaign to strangle Britain. The deeper wound, however, was not in the tonnage tables but in the minds of the men who crewed the boats. For 3 years, the U-boat service had carried itself with the confidence of a weapon that could not be countered, a force that struck from beneath the surface and vanished before retaliation could arrive. Black May destroyed that belief in a matter of weeks. Post-war interrogations and captured records traced the collapse of morale with clinical precision, describing crews who set out on patrol with the expectation that they would not return, and commanders who no longer spoke of victory but only of the odds of survival on the next crossing. The scale of the loss made the change permanent. The U-boat arm had always depended on its veteran commanders, the men who had learned the trade in the early years and passed their instincts to the boats around them. Those men were now dying faster than they could be replaced, and the schools that trained their successors could not manufacture experience. Each patrol that failed to return took with it not only a hull but a store of hard-won knowledge, and the surviving crews felt the absence of those men as a widening silence in their own ranks. The service that emerged from Black May was younger, greener, and fatally aware of its own mortality. That awareness never lifted. The German submariners who survived to the end of the war carried the memory of that spring as the moment their world had changed, the point at which the sea stopped being their hunting ground and became their grave. The confidence of 1940 and 1941, the swagger of the early wolf packs and the second happy time, had been ground away into something closer to fatalism, and no infusion of new boats or new weapons ever restored it. The psychological defeat proved as durable as the material one, and it shaped the conduct of the U-boat war through every month that remained. Black May, then, was more than a statistical peak in the graph of submarine losses. It was the point at which the entire architecture of the Allied anti-submarine effort, the intelligence, the aircraft, the technology, and the hunting groups that men like Walker had forged, came together and functioned as a single instrument. The convoys crossed, the invasion buildup continued, and the U-boats withdrew into the deeper waters to nurse a fear they would never shake. The battle for the Atlantic had not ended, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. By the winter of 1943, a single phrase had begun to circulate through the U-boat pens at Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire, spoken quietly among crews preparing for patrol. The men had learned to fear a particular formation of British ships, a group whose arrival in a stretch of ocean seemed to mark the water as cursed. They did not know all the details, and they did not need to. They knew that when certain destroyers and sloops appeared, boats stopped returning, and the knowledge alone was enough to hollow out the confidence of hardened crews. That formation was Walker's second support group, and its reputation had grown far faster than any official acknowledgement on the Allied side could account for. German submariners rarely knew the name of the man who commanded the ships hunting them, but they came to recognize the pattern of his work. A U-boat detected by Walker's group did not face a hurried attack and a swift departure. It faced a slow, methodical siege that could last for hours and often stretched across an entire day and into the night, the escorts circling patiently overhead while the boat below strained to endure. Word of these ordeals passed from crew to crew, from the few survivors and from the intercepted signals that hinted at what had happened, until the group's presence carried a weight all its own. The fear was rational, built on accumulating evidence rather than superstition, though it took on the shape of superstition as it spread. A commander who received a sighting report placing him near the group's operating area faced a choice that no early war captain would have recognized. To press an attack on a nearby convoy meant exposing the boat to a hunting force that had proven again and again that it did not give up. To withdraw meant surrendering the initiative and abandoning the offensive purpose for which the boat had sailed. More and more commanders chose caution, diving deep and running silent long before contact was made, sacrificing opportunity for the faint hope of survival. This was precisely the psychological victory Walker had set out to achieve. His relentless pursuit had never been intended merely to sink individual submarines, though it did that with grim efficiency. It was intended to break the will of the men inside them, to strip away the sense of safety that the depths had once provided. A U-boat had always relied on the assumption that if it stayed submerged and silent long enough, its hunters would exhaust their patience and their fuel and move on. Walker demolished that assumption. His ships carried the endurance and the discipline to remain overhead for as long as it took, and his creeping attacks meant that a submerged boat could be struck without warning, without the reassuring sound of an approaching propeller that had once told a captain when to brace and when to relax. The effect on morale was corrosive in a way that mounting losses alone could not fully explain. sweep the area, perhaps make a second run, and then, bound by its duty to the convoy it protected, it would turn away and rejoin the merchant ships it was there to guard. Walker's support group carried no such obligation. It existed to hunt, unbound from any convoy, free to devote itself entirely to the destruction of a single boat for as long as the pursuit demanded. This freedom transformed the mathematics of survival that every U-boat commander carried in his head. The old calculations, refined over years of experience, no longer held, and the men who had built their confidence on them found that confidence dissolving. For the ordinary submariner, the young mechanic or torpedo man crammed into a hull that had already become a place of dread, the prospect of encountering the group represented the sharpest form of the fear that now permeated the entire service. The wider collapse of morale that followed Black May had left the crews expecting death as a general condition of their work, but the thought of a prolonged hunt by Walker's ships focused that abstract dread into something specific and unbearable. It was one thing to accept that a boat might not return. It was another to imagine the particular manner in which it would be tracked, cornered, and destroyed, hour by patient hour, by an enemy that had made a science of the process. Dönitz and his staff understood the problem, and they understood that it could not be solved by exhortation. They pinned their hopes on new technology and new boats, on the snorkel that would let a submarine recharge its batteries while submerged, on the fast electric boats that were meant to restore the offensive edge. But those solutions lay in the future, and the men patrolling in the winter of 1943 and into 1944 had to sail in the boats they had, into waters they now regarded as hostile territory rather than a hunting ground. The psychological damage inflicted by formations like Walker's could not be repaired by promises of future equipment. It had already lodged itself in the culture of the service, in the expectations men carried aboard, in the quiet fatalism that shaped every decision at sea. By the time the group's reputation reached its height, it had achieved something that no amount of tonnage sunk could measure directly. It had become, in the minds of the men it hunted, the embodiment of the fate they most feared, a living proof that the depths were no longer a refuge. For the German submariners who tracked its movements through their intelligence and their rumors, the appearance of Walker's second support group in their operating area was not merely a threat among many. It was the single outcome they dreaded above all others, and that dread, more than any weapon, marked how completely the balance of the Atlantic War had turned. When Allied intelligence officers began interrogating the survivors of sunk U-boats, they expected to catalog technical details, patrol routes, and the mechanics of German operations. What they found instead was something harder to quantify and far more revealing. Again and again, the captured crewmen spoke of a single formation with a mixture of hatred and awe that set it apart from every other adversary they had faced. The prisoners, drawn from boats destroyed across the North Atlantic and the approaches to the Bay of Biscay, described the second support group not as one enemy among many, but as a distinct and dreaded presence, a hunter whose methods they had come to understand only too well. These interrogation reports, compiled at holding centers where German submariners were questioned in the weeks after their capture, offered the Allies a rare window into the mind of the enemy. The men spoke of the relentlessness of the pursuit, of hours spent submerged and silent while depth charges fell in patient, methodical patterns rather than the frantic bursts of a conventional escort. They described the peculiar horror of realizing that the ships above them were not going to leave, that no convoy waited to draw the attackers away, that the hunt would continue until the boat was destroyed or forced to the surface. Their testimony confirmed what Walker's crews had suspected from the pattern of their own successes. The tactics were working not only on the boats they sank, but on every crew that heard the stories and carried them back into the deep. German naval intelligence reached the same conclusion by a different route. The staff around Admiral Dönitz tracked Allied escort formations with considerable care, correlating the loss reports of missing boats with the known movements of enemy warships. Over the course of 1943 and into the following year, a pattern emerged that could not be ignored. Certain operating areas had become graveyards, and the appearance of a particular support group in those waters correlated with an alarming spike in boats that failed to return. The German command understood that it was facing not a matter of chance or the ordinary attrition of war, but a concentrated and deliberate threat, a specialized instrument built for the express purpose of destroying submarines, and doing so with an efficiency that ordinary escorts had never achieved. This recognition mattered because it forced a reassessment at the highest levels of the U-boat command. Dönitz had built his entire strategy on the assumption that the submarine's chief advantage lay in its ability to disappear, to submerge and slip away while the surface enemy searched blindly overhead. The support group had inverted that assumption. Its combination of persistent contact, coordinated attack, and freedom from convoy obligation meant that submerging no longer guaranteed escape. German intelligence assessments of the period reflected a growing awareness that the balance of the technical and tactical contest had shifted, and that the formations responsible were not to be treated as isolated encounters, but as evidence of a systematic Allied superiority in the hunting of submarines. Against that backdrop, Walker's own name began to carry a weight far beyond that of an individual commander. Within the tightly knit world of the U-boat service, where crews shared stories in the mess halls of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire between patrols, the reputation of the man and his ship spread through rumor and repetition. The submariners did not always know the details accurately, and the legend that grew around him often outran the documented facts, but the essential truth of it was firmly grounded. To sail into waters where his group operated was understood to be a sentence of extraordinary danger. His name had become, in the language of the men who feared him most, a synonym for the death that waited in the depths. There was a particular cruelty in the way this fear operated, because it attacked the one thing a submarine crew could not do without. A U-boat's effectiveness depended on the willingness of its commander to press home an attack, to close with a convoy, to hold his nerve while depth charges fell, and to remain on station in dangerous waters rather than withdrawing to safety. Fear corroded every one of those requirements. A commander who believed that a prolonged hunt awaited him was more likely to break off an approach, to dive early, to abandon a promising position, or to remain submerged and passive when boldness was called for. The psychological pressure translated directly into diminished aggression, and diminished aggression meant fewer merchant ships sunk and fewer risks taken. In this way, the reputation of the group achieved results that extended far beyond the boats it physically destroyed. The Allied command grasped this dimension of the campaign, even if the language of psychological warfare was not yet the settled vocabulary it would later become. Walker himself understood instinctively that mariners who had once regarded the Atlantic as their hunting ground now regarded it as a place where they were the hunted, and the shadow of the second support group lay across every patrol into the contested waters. The psychological wound went deep, and it never healed. Long after Walker himself had passed from the scene, the memory of what his ships had done remained lodged in the culture of a service that had learned, at terrible cost, to fear a single enemy above all others. That fear was not merely a matter of morale, it shaped tactics, altered routes, and forced commanders to weigh every decision against the possibility that the group hunting them was the one they most dreaded. When a wolf pack was ordered to concentrate against a convoy, the men in the boats knew that the escort screen might contain the very ships whose methods had already claimed so many of their number. The knowledge changed behavior. Captains grew cautious where they had once been bold, and hesitation in the underwater war could be as fatal as recklessness. The methods that produced this fear were not accidents of luck. Walker had refined a system in which his ships worked as a coordinated pack of their own, holding contact on a submerged boat for hours, sometimes for an entire day, refusing to break off until the target was destroyed. The creeping attack he devised allowed one ship to guide another onto a submarine that had gone silent and deep, denying the crew the escape that had so often saved them in earlier years. A U-boat that had once dived and waited for the escorts to lose patience now found that the patience belonged to the hunters. The depth charges came in patterns designed to trap rather than merely to punish, and the men below could do nothing but listen to the propellers overhead and wait to learn whether this pass would be the one that broke the hull. The record of the second support group during its most active period reads as a catalogue of relentless pursuit. Boats were destroyed in rapid succession during single operations, sometimes several in the span of days, in engagements that left no survivors to carry warning back to base. German command noticed the pattern: the concentration of losses in certain sectors, the speed with which contact turned into destruction, and the failure of boats to return from waters that had once been survivable, all pointed to an enemy who had solved the problem of the submerged submarine. Intelligence assessments circulated among the U-boat arm acknowledged that the balance had shifted and that the hunters below had become the hunted. For the crews, the human cost was measured in the silence of unanswered signals. A boat that failed to report was a boat that would never report again, and the families ashore learned only that their men were missing, lost in an ocean that gave up few of its dead. The mess halls at the bases emptied of familiar faces, and the replacements who arrived were younger, less experienced, and more likely to be lost on their first patrol. The service that had begun the war with confidence and swagger now sent its men to sea knowing that the odds had turned against them, and that a particular set of ships waited in the approaches to make the odds worse still. What made the fear so durable was that it outlasted the man who created it. The tactics he had proven were adopted across the escort forces, taught to other commanders, and applied in operations he never personally directed. The shadow he cast did not lift when he left the sea, it spread, and in the memory of the men who survived those years, one name and one group of ships remained fixed as the embodiment of the moment when the Atlantic ceased to be their hunting ground and became instead the place where they learned, patrol by patrol, what it meant to be prey. The war did not stand still, and neither did Walker. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the German U-boat arm scrambled to recover from the disasters that had emptied its bases and shattered its confidence. New weapons appeared in the Atlantic, and with them new problems for the men who hunted beneath the surface. Walker studied each development with the same cold attention he had brought to every phase of the campaign. refusing to let the enemy regain the initiative that had cost the Allies so dearly in the darkest years. Among the innovations that troubled the escort forces was the acoustic homing torpedo, a weapon designed to chase the sound of a warship's propellers and detonate against the hull that had come to hunt. It was a direct answer to the aggressive tactics Walker had made famous, a device meant to punish the very boldness that had turned the tide. The Germans also fitted their boats with improved radar detection gear and experimented with the schnorkel, a breathing tube that allowed a submarine to run its diesels while remaining submerged, reducing the exposure that had made surfaced U-boats such easy prey for aircraft and centimetric radar. Each of these measures was intended to restore the advantage of concealment that Walker had stripped away. He answered them methodically. When the acoustic torpedo appeared, escort commanders learned to stream noise-making decoys astern, dragging devices whose clatter drew the weapon away from the ships themselves. Walker incorporated the countermeasure into his group's drills and adjusted his approaches so that his ships remained lethal without offering the torpedo an easy target. When the snorkel made boats harder to catch on the surface, he leaned harder into the submerged hunt, the patient, hours-long pursuit that had already broken so many crews. The technology changed, but the underlying principle did not. A submarine could hide, but it could not hide forever, and Walker built his tactics around outlasting whatever the enemy invented. This constant adaptation demanded an extraordinary toll from the men who carried it out. The hunts that made the second support group so feared were also brutal ordeals for its own sailors. Holding contact on a submerged boat for 6 hours, 10 hours, sometimes longer, meant that officers and ratings alike stood at their stations in a state of unbroken tension, listening to the ping of the ASDIC and the reports of the operators, waiting for the moment when the pattern of the hunt would resolve into a kill. Sleep came in fragments. Meals were eaten at action stations or not at all. The North Atlantic itself punished them with cold, with storms, and with seas that flung the small escorts about until standing upright was an effort of will. Walker drove himself hardest of all. He was on the bridge for the duration of the long hunts, refusing to leave the direction of the attack to subordinates when a submarine lay somewhere beneath his ships. The intensity that made him effective also consumed him. Those who served under him described a man who seemed to run on pure determination, who would not rest while a U-boat remained undestroyed, and who carried the weight of every engagement as though the outcome of the entire war depended on it. The strain that wore down his crews wore him down more, though he rarely showed it and never allowed it to slow the pace of his operations. Yet the same relentlessness that exhausted his men also bound them to him. Walker's leadership produced a loyalty that went beyond the ordinary obedience of naval discipline. His sailors believed in him because he had proven, again and again, that his methods worked, that the confidence he demanded was justified by results, and that the ships under his command were more likely to bring their crews home than any others in the fleet. When his sloops returned to Liverpool after a successful patrol, crowds gathered on the quayside and nerves of the men who bore it. The unrelenting tempo of operations, the physical hardship of the North Atlantic, and the mental burden of hunts that stretched across entire days accumulated over months and years. For a commander who never spared himself, the accumulation was especially dangerous. The very qualities that had made Walker the terror of the U-boat crews, his refusal to rest, his total commitment to the pursuit, his insistence on directing every attack in person, were qualities that drew steadily on reserves that even the strongest man could not renew indefinitely. Still, through it all, the group pressed on. Patrol followed patrol, hunt followed hunt, and the tally of destroyed submarines continued to climb. The methods Walker had pioneered were now proven beyond any doubt, spreading through the escort forces and shaping the conduct of the entire anti-submarine campaign. The Atlantic that had once belonged to the wolf packs had become the domain of the hunters, and no group embodied that transformation more completely than the ships Walker led. The relentless pursuit that defined his war showed no sign of easing, even as the strain it imposed pointed toward a reckoning that no amount of determination could hold off forever. By the summer of 1944, the man who had transformed the Battle of the Atlantic was visibly failing. Frederic John Walker had spent more than a year driving himself with a ferocity that recognized no limit, and the toll had become impossible to disguise. Those who served alongside him watched the change come slowly and then all at once. The captain who had directed every hunt from the bridge, who had gone without sleep through pursuits that lasted days, who had refused to leave the sea while U-boats remained to be destroyed, was consuming himself in the service of the campaign he had done so much to win. The pressures upon him were unlike those borne by almost any other officer of the war. Command of the second support group demanded not merely competence but total presence. Walker had built his methods on personal control, on the conviction that the destruction of a submarine required a directing intelligence at every stage of the attack. That conviction had made his group the most feared formation in the Atlantic, but it left no margin for rest. Every patrol drew on reserves that were never fully replenished. Every hunt added to a burden that accumulated across the months without pause. He returned from his final patrols exhausted in a way that even his iron determination could not conceal. The physical hardship of the North Atlantic, the constant tension of operations, and the emotional weight of command had combined into something that no willpower could hold at bay. On the 10th of July 1944, at the Royal Naval Hospital in Liverpool, Frederic John Walker suffered a cerebral thrombosis. He died on that day, aged 52. The immediate cause was a clot upon the brain, but the deeper cause was the war itself and the manner in which he had chosen to fight it. He had, in the plainest sense, worn himself to death in the pursuit of the enemy. The reaction across the Royal Navy was immediate and profound. Walker was not merely a successful officer. He was the embodiment of the transformation that had turned the Atlantic from a graveyard of merchant ships into a killing ground for U-boats. His methods had spread through the escort forces, his reputation had reached into the minds of the enemy, and his group had accounted for more submarines than any other formation in the fleet. To lose him at the very moment when victory in the Atlantic had become certain was a blow that struck at both the practical and the symbolic heart of the campaign. His funeral reflected the standing he had earned. The service was held at Liverpool Cathedral, the city from which so many of his patrols had begun, and to which the survival of Britain's supply lines was so intimately tied. Thousands attended. The streets carried the marks of a community that understood what the man had meant, not only to the Navy but to the wider war effort that depended upon the sea. His body was committed to the waters of the approaches he had defended, buried at sea in the manner befitting an officer who had made the ocean his battlefield. It was a fitting end for a commander whose entire career had been bound to the deep. The honors that came to Walker measured the extent of what he had achieved. He had already been recognized during his lifetime with repeated distinctions, awarded again and again as his group compiled its record of destruction. The Distinguished Service Order, granted and then added to across successive patrols, marked a pattern of achievement almost unmatched among officers of his rank. After his death, further recognition followed, sealing his reputation in the formal record of the service he had transformed. The accumulation of these awards told a clear story. Here was an officer who had not merely performed his duty, but had redefined how that duty could be carried out. What the medals could not fully capture was the scale of his influence upon the war. When Walker had first pressed his ideas about hunting submarines, the Royal Navy had regarded him as an eccentric attached to a specialty that offered little prospect of advancement. He had been passed over, sidelined, and left to develop his theories in relative obscurity. Yet those very theories, once given the chance to prove themselves, had reshaped the entire anti-submarine campaign. The creeping attack, the relentless pursuit, the refusal to accept a submerged U-boat as an escaped one, all of it had flowed from a single mind convinced that the submarine could be beaten by discipline rather than by luck. His group had turned that conviction into results that no one could dispute. Under his command, the ships of the Second Support Group had destroyed U-boats in numbers that placed the formation at the very top of the Royal Navy's anti-submarine record. More than that, they had inflicted a psychological defeat upon the enemy that outlasted any individual engagement. German commanders had come to regard the waters he patrolled as the most dangerous in the ocean, and the caution born of that fear had degraded their effectiveness as attackers. Walker had not simply sunk submarines, he had broken the confidence of the men who crewed them. That achievement had come at a moment when it mattered most. The convoys upon which Britain depended had been under existential threat, and the balance of the Atlantic had hung in doubt through the darkest stretches of the war. The tactics Walker developed, the training he demanded, and the aggression he instilled had contributed directly to the reversal of that threat. By the time of his death, the U-boat arm had been driven from its former dominance into a defensive struggle for survival, and the supply lines that sustained the Allied war effort had been secured. The invasion of Europe, launched only weeks before he died, had depended upon the safe passage of men and materials across the very ocean he had helped to reclaim. His legacy, therefore, rested not on a single battle, but on the whole transformation of a campaign. He had proven that the submarine, once feared as an almost invulnerable predator, could be hunted down and destroyed by ships that applied method, patience, and unrelenting pressure. He had shown that morale itself could be attacked, that the fear he imposed upon the enemy was as decisive as any depth charge, and he had built a formation whose competence outlived him, carrying his methods forward through the final phases of the war. Frederic John Walker died before the war he had shaped reached its conclusion, but the outcome in the Atlantic was no longer in doubt. The ocean that had once belonged to the wolf packs had become the hunting ground of the escorts, and the man who had done more than any other to bring about that reversal was gone. His name endured in the record of destroyed U-boats, in the testimony of captured German crews who spoke of him with dread, and in the tactics that continued to govern the campaign. consequence flowed directly from that tactical success. Britain's survival had depended on the convoys, and the convoys had depended on the defeat of the U-boat. By the middle of 1944, the ocean that had once threatened to strangle the island had been secured, and the flow of men, fuel, and equipment across it had become dependable. The invasion of Normandy, launched in June of that year, rested upon Atlantic supply lines that were no longer in serious doubt. Every soldier landed in France, every ton of ammunition unloaded on the beaches, had crossed water that Walker and men like him had reclaimed from the enemy. His work was not glamorous, and it happened far from the headlines, but the entire edifice of the Allied campaign in Western Europe stood on the foundation it provided. Yet the deepest mark he left was not on charts or tonnage tables, but on the minds of the men he had hunted. German U-boat crews had gone to sea in the early war years with confidence that the deep would shelter them, that once submerged they could slip away and survive. Walker's group had destroyed that confidence in the most literal way by refusing to let contact go and by turning long submersions into slow executions. Captured crews spoke of the fear with a candor that unsettled their interrogators. They described the particular dread of knowing that a persistent hunter was overhead, waiting, unwilling to be shaken. That fear did not vanish when a boat returned to port. It traveled with the survivors, and it spread through the flotillas as a rumor that hardened into conviction. The psychological damage was cumulative and it was permanent. A submarine crew that no longer believed in its own survival could not press home attacks with the boldness that the wolfpack tactics demanded. Commanders grew cautious, dived earlier, withdrew sooner, and abandoned promising positions rather than risk the prolonged pursuit that had killed so many of their comrades. This corrosion of aggression was a weapon in its own right, and it degraded the U-boat arm even in engagements where Walker's ships were nowhere near. The reputation had become a force multiplier reaching further than any single vessel could sail. Long after the specific hunts ended, the memory of them shaped the behavior of an enemy who had learned to expect the worst. That is why his name occupied a place in the German consciousness that few Allied officers ever achieved. To the sailors of the Kriegsmarine, he was not an abstraction but a specific menace, associated with specific waters and a specific manner of dying. The graveyards their own intelligence identified were, in part, monuments to his method. A commander who could inspire that kind of dread in an enemy had achieved something beyond the arithmetic of sinkings. He had entered the mental world of the men he fought and taken residence there as a permanent source of fear. The story of how he arrived at that position carries its own lessons. Walker had spent decades convinced that the submarine would decide future wars, and he had been ignored, passed over, and left to watch as the Navy invested its faith in the traditions of surface combat. His ideas about hunting rather than defending ran against official doctrine, and for years that dissent cost him advancement. When the crisis finally came, it was precisely those unfashionable ideas that supplied the answer. His career stands as a demonstration that innovation often looks like stubbornness until the moment it becomes indispensable, and that the determination to pursue an unpopular conviction can matter more than rank or reputation. It also stands as a lesson in relentlessness. The single quality that defined every one of his tactics was the refusal to quit. Where earlier escorts had dropped a pattern of charges and moved on, satisfied to have driven a U-boat away, Walker had insisted that driving away was not enough. The enemy had to be destroyed, and destruction required staying with the contact for hours, sometimes for the better part of a day, until the sea gave up its prey. That patience demanded discipline from his crews, and exacted a punishing toll on their nerves and their bodies. and it exacted the ultimate price from him. He drove himself as hard as he drove his ships, and the strain that killed him in July 1944 was inseparable from the intensity that made him effective. His victory and his death came from the same source. The legend that survives him is therefore not a matter of exaggeration but of accurate memory. He remains in the record of the Battle of the Atlantic, the most successful anti-submarine commander the war produced, a man who took a losing campaign and helped turn it into a decisive Allied victory. The tactics that bear the imprint of his thinking shaped the navies that came after. The strategic outcome he secured underwrote the liberation of Europe, and the fear he planted in his enemy never fully faded from the men who felt it. His name endures as the U-boat's greatest dread, earned in the cold and endless waters of the North Atlantic, where he proved that even the most feared predator of the sea could be hunted to its end by a hunter who simply would not stop. The ocean that had once belonged to the wolf packs became, in the final reckoning, the domain of the escorts who learned to pursue without mercy. Frederic John Walker had made that transformation possible, and though he did not live to see the war concluded, the sea he had fought to reclaim